Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tech Shift F9 podcast. I'm your host, Maurizio, and this is the podcast that talks about career paths, career transformations, and pivots, and just very interesting careers from amazing guests. This week we have the one and only Emory Takagi. Emory is lead product designer at JGC here in Japan. JGC is a large engineering conglomerate. And Emory started off, however, in teaching, and I think during COVID made a pivot into technology and UI UX design. Emory, welcome to the show. It's great having you here.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here and happy to talk about tech shifting.
Fabulous. So, Emory, what really captured me about your background is the fact that not only you changed career quite, in my eyes at least, a little bit drastically after several years
Mm,
teaching, particularly teaching younger kids here in
mm.
Japan, but you did it during COVID. You did it in a foreign country. You're American, living in Japan, and so you sort of made it a little bit hard for yourself, didn't you? But
That I wouldn't have it any other way. That's just I always choose to take the most difficult path. Not because I want to. I'm just really not good at pre-planning, I think. And once I'm already eyeballs deep in something, I'm stubborn enough to keep going. So
got
that's
it.
just my own habits, I think.
And we'll dig into that a little bit because a lot of the guests that I have on my show always ask the question like, how do you prepare ahead of a career change? How much goes into your technical skills building and or your networking and this and that. But I think with you we'll have perhaps a different perspective. But before we talk about the actual shift, I want to understand a little bit about your interests in teaching, your interest in Japan, and what kind of experience did you get out of that work with fairly young children in international schools for your career currently?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll back up and start from the beginning here. I lived with a lot of Japanese in university and Koreans and other people from Asia, foreign students. So I thought I was currently at the time studying to get a bachelor's of fine arts. So I was already in an artistic path, a creative path, you might say. So ultimately, once I graduated, I had the choice between graduate school to get my master's, but I felt like Japan was the right decision. So I decided I'd spend what I said would be a couple of years in Asia and see what it's like. But 10 years later, here we are. But it gets you. Japan has that hold on people. But so I took an ALT teaching job, and I think a lot of expats do that just to get your foot in the door, just to get a visa, just to really get a feel for Japan because I think Japan is this exciting foreign land. I mean, they do a great job of marketing and branding, let's be honest. So, but living here, working here, in as an ALT, the pay was atrocious. Like, especially going 10 years ago, it was just survivable. Now I'm really feeling for those teachers, but
Just so the audience understands, ALTs are
yeah,
alternative language teachers or assistant
assistant,
language assistant
assistant,
language.
yeah. Legally, we don't, nobody has a teaching license. Well, if you do, you shouldn't be an ALT, but even some people with teaching licenses just choose to be ALTs, just again, to get into the position, to see what Japan's like, to see if they want to stay. But legally, we are not allowed to be alone in a classroom in a public
Got it.
school. So that's why they emphasize the A in assistant. So after that, I really loved my first placement was in a high school. It was with high school kids. I felt like a rock star, honestly. I was like the hot new foreign teacher on the block, and that was great. Because in Japan, they treat high schools like baby universities, so
Right.
it's very
Yes.
advanced in their careers. The facility was amazing. I felt like, oh, I'm like winning at my first year of Japan here, and then I got switched to like what I felt was like an at-risk elementary school. And
Oh,
like,
wow. What a change.
yeah. Oh, what a change. And they had to bring in a specialist because of behavioral issues on a lot of the students. But I mean, I grew up in like at-risk schools all the time, honestly.
Okay.
So I just felt like just shaking my head like you guys think you're bad, but you're not bad. Like you don't know what I've seen like in school systems in America. But
That's scary.
aside from that, I was very much done working as an ALT, and I was very much done working in the public school system. Then I started to transition to early education, and I must say I loved early education. Kids are, I can't even say wonderful. They're such heathens. They're monsters, but the growth and the effort you put in working with them is just like is an amazing thing. So ultimately, I worked for a few private schools. I ended up at Tokyo International School for several years. I loved it there. But really, it just, I think teaching tends to burn out a lot of people, and they get to a point where you either just continue burned out as a teacher because there's not a lot of alternatives for career paths in Japan for foreign expats, or you just leave Japan. And I think
Mm.
that's where a lot of people are. And I hated seeing that in a lot of people. And I thought, well, no, 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 there has to be an alternative to this without having like native level Japanese, because my Japanese is conversational. It's about an N3 if we're talking technicality. So for me, it was just a matter of, okay, I got to sink or swim here. Like, I
Hmm.
can't go home. I have, at the time I was like engaged to my now Japanese husband. So going home, it just wasn't a good option. But that's when COVID was starting to hit. And they're like, oh, I think you should come home. But honestly, I'm like, America's the last place I feel like I need to
Right.
be in this mess right now. So I decided to stay and buckle down my final years of teaching. By the time I went through a few more schools while I was also beginning to study UX UI design. And at the time, there's a lot of remote courses, a lot of online classes. It was a great time to be online and learning new skills, getting new like course certifications. It was an awesome time, even though the world was going through such a mess. So I was studying and still trying to work freelance, understand if I even wanted to do UX UI design, because ultimately I was like, well, I'm not honoring my degree in fine arts here. I need to like find a more creative path. And honestly, all my years in teaching, I felt like I was missing out on like the current tech, because like
Right.
Japan's pretty low tech in a lot
In
of the
some
daily.
aspects. Mm.
Oh yeah, in a lot of daily aspects. So I felt like I'm like, oh, I don't even know how to like use the current office programs or like anything. Like I feel like I'm missing out. And so that was also a push for me to look into tech too. So I ended up director of the English program was my last position. And then I'm like, okay, I'm done. It's time to transition. It's time to go into tech full steam ahead.
That's amazing. And Emory, I mean, you obviously touched upon a positive aspect, or maybe one of the few positive aspects of COVID that gave people time to do other things, right? And to
Yeah, definitely.
looking at different options. But you must have felt a little bit overwhelmed with just the amount of courses out there and potential career paths. Obviously, you have an artistic tendency and talent,
Mm,
and you wanted to pair it up with something else. But how did you,
definitely.
what was your thought process to get into uh, a more techie role? Was it because of the availability of the request that there was for that kind of role? You said, yeah, that's a good opportunity for me. Or was there something more of a professional sort of interest that you had in something like UX, UI design?
I'd say I think it's a pretty solid balance of both because as I mentioned, I felt like I'm getting behind in all the tech roles, and all of my friends back home in the States or all the people that I know were like, okay, they're pretty like they seem very tech forward, which really isn't that tech forward, but because when you're in roles outside of tech, you're like, oh man, I'm missing out on updates here in the
Right.
world. And so I was looking into tech programs and positions. I'm like, well, I don't want to do coding. I tried coding, and I'm like, okay, beyond basic HTML and CMS, like or CSS, I was like, oh no, I don't like any of this. None of this makes me happy
Fair
because
enough.
I think my creative, yeah, I really want to be better at coding, but I think my creative tendencies pull too hard there, where I'm like, oh, better stay away from numbers. And also, fun fact, I've failed at like every math class I've ever had in school.
Okay.
So, numbers, I
No
knew
judgment
numbers
here.
like, oh, heavy judgment on me, on myself. But I think for me it's just like, okay, I need to like stay with what I know what I'm good at. And so UX UI kept coming up several times here. And I'm like, okay, well, fine. Let me just look into that. I talked with some recruiters, which of course recruiters do their job. They're trying to get people in the program so they can get paid. So I'm like, okay, well, are you just telling me this stuff or do I really want to be in this program? So ultimately, I ended up at the UX Design Institute, which focused a lot on UX. And now I feel like I do a lot of UI, which is fine because it was it touched on both, but ultimately it did give me a nice little intro into something. And I'm like, you know what? Let me see if like this is for me. Let me see if I want to go into this, which that's the easy part. The doing the coursework and like completing the course, like because it was a 6 month program, which you could do it
Okay.
longer or shorter if you're really powering through. But I was still working as a teacher and finishing that up. So I think for me at that point, it was like that was the easy part. It was like, oh, okay, yeah, I like this enough. I'm gonna continue this. The hard part is securing the position after and convincing companies and teams and opportunities that you are the person for the job. And in Japan, that was nearly impossible. It took me a year and a half before I got hired into like a Japanese company.
Let's talk about that, Emory, because I mean, you
Oh
had
yeah.
quite a few things going against you, to be honest, right? I mean, you had the fact that generally it wasn't great for the economy with all the
Mm-hmm.
uncertainty of COVID. You were a foreigner, obviously, always makes it a little bit
Mm-hmm.
difficult, more difficult
Always.
for us. Um, and you're a newbie. So, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, although it took you a year and a half, in my
Mm.
eyes, that's actually a pretty good timeline because uh, there was just so much that was going against you in a sense. So, how did you, what
Oh
was your
yeah.
approach to that? And also on a personal level, maybe, how did you stay sane in that period? Because you can be crushed by unfortunately, the negativity of not getting anywhere for an extended period of time.
It wasn't only like, oh, it was as you said, I like to make things hard for myself. So let's start off with that. But I think ultimately in that situation, I was very blessed that I had a spouse visa now. I didn't have to worry about the visa. On the
That's
other
good.
hand, I was only doing part-time work and soft work. So my savings, my personal savings from all those years of teaching was depleting because I was convinced I didn't need to apply for unemployment because, oh, I'm that opportunity is right around the corner. And the corner turned into almost 2 years of unemployment, like formally unemployment. So it was a lot of freelance jobs, it was a lot of independent case studies. It was a lot of just grabbing opportunities. I even checked Craigslist. So okay, that's how like that's
It's scraping
how
the
like
bottom of the barrel.
oh man, isn't it though? But like it was at that point, it was like whatever and however I could get in. And as you said, I still wasn't like business level or native Japanese, which in Japan, even now, there's that term UX maturity still, where it's like companies are like, what is a UX designer and why do we even need one? It's a buzzword, it sounds cool. But actually, a lot of people who I interviewed didn't even really know the role or understand the role. So
Right.
I'm just talking to people who are like graphic designer question mark and I'm like no 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 wrong wrong person. They're like, but we need illustrators. Okay, but why are you talking to me then? So it was like not only the frustration of like people won't hire me because I don't speak a high enough Japanese, I'm not experienced enough, and also like they're asking me to pull out graphic design portfolios in the middle of like a user experience and interface meeting. So I'm
Wow.
like, what? So it's just as you said, yeah, it was a lot of staying sane. I think one time I was sitting in the car and I got like 10 rejection emails in a row.
Oh my
And I'm
goodness.
like, that's enough. That's enough to send you over the edge. I think I got at least 100 no's, like over the course of like a year and a half. Like it must have been more. But honestly, a lot of people they don't get back to you anyway. So it was
Fair
just
enough.
like to really at the bottom the bottom line is what was my alternative? My alternative was to go back to teaching or leave Japan. And I was determined to not do either of those things. So it was just a keep going until it wasn't possible. Another company did offer me a teaching position at their brand new company. They were starting, it was a Juku, a very established Juku, and they were starting in kindergarten. They even gave me the walkthrough of the building they were refurbishing. They were going to make me director of marketing and education. And
Okay.
that was like, and they were going to pay me for it. And, but I'm like, okay, it's like that old teaching grabbing at me again. And I'm like, no, no, no. If you don't say no and don't step out of your position, then you're just going to continue teaching for the rest of your time in Japan. I didn't want to have that all on my resume because I know I have to go back to America and get a teaching degree. I don't want to go back to school again for a teaching degree, which would be at a 4-year college. I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to worry about being a teacher in America, honestly. And so, yeah, it was just like I could not give up because the alternative was not going to happen for me. Like, I refused whatever the alternative was. And I think that made me stubborn enough to continue until I finally got placed into Rakuten.
I mean, that's very interesting to me because it does sound that although you may say you make things hard for yourselves, but there's a lot of thought that has gone into that decision making, and the
Mm,
fact that you have thought through what you want to do gave you that strength to keep going even when the situation was a little bit tough. So kudos to you.
mm,
Then Rakuten
thank you.
happened, as you just said, and not only you worked on UX UI design, which was must have been very exciting for you, the first time you actually did professionally get paid for it, but you also
Mm,
started working on some really new tech and hot tech at the time, NFTs, right?
oh, yeah,
So
definitely.
how did that feel, and how did you get yourself? I mean, I guess you weren't really into crypto or decentralized finance and that
Mm.
all that stuff. So what happened then? How did you manage to survive that impact?
Well, I mean, in a way, I kind of didn't survive it because,
Okay,
to
fair
be
enough.
honest. But going through it, as you said, the NFT was the hot new tech and the hot new buzzword in the tech field in Japan. Of course, Rakuten's a very forward company, and so they wanted to get a hold of that. And I think realistically, NFTs and like it's just kind of like online card collecting and online memorabilia collecting, which in Japan I think is a very good market with the
Yeah,
idols, with what we were doing in marketing. So I got to work
Pokemon.
on like Pokemon. It's insane. So I was working on like these random things. Even JP Post has a page on the NFT. So, but it was kind of weird because I know the elderly population is so vast in Japan. So I know they have a hard time understanding NFTs, but still there was such a market drive here. So I think I really enjoyed my time in it. And as like an artist, because I have my own fine arts brand anyway. So NFTs, like all the artists were like, you gotta get NFTs, you gotta get NFT. I'm still not really convinced. But I really enjoyed my team. It was very international. But honestly, I feel like I was coming in with very advanced designers in my first
Hmm.
official position from like freelancing and working independently pretty much. And so it was a very Rakuten is they are very fast paced environment. And so unfortunately when NFTs started falling out, it was kind of like contracts changing. Basically they did want people with more crypto and Bitcoin experience, but I did a lot of nice contributions while I was there. Like the countdown timer, I got to design that. I got to design the share component for the whole site. So it was just those little like nuances because I really enjoyed who I worked with, 100%. But then at the time when things came to a transitional end, I should say, that's when I moved into JGC, and then I started working in engineering and construction there. So like, yeah, what a shift if to coin the term on the podcast.
Absolutely. And but before we get to JGC and your current position and what you're doing
Sure.
potentially in the future, I'm interested in a little bit how you went about your this experience in working in a more structured environment. And I'm not saying when
Mm,
you worked at schools it wasn't structured, but obviously
sure.
you spent a few years freelancing, um,
Mm,
and school is a little bit different than tech company. So
mm,
how did you handle that part of the work? I mean, how did you, for example, connect with other employees or your colleagues, and or were you
mm.
just purely focusing on yourself and your skills and making sure you were not the weak link in the chain, so to say, since you were so new?
I think it was a lot of everything and a lot of especially at Rakuten. I was like, okay, I'm the newbie and like, I'm still learning all these like structures and things and the design systems and things that I didn't get to learn because I mean, yeah, when you're working by yourself, when you're not working as an intern or anything else, then you're like, oh my gosh, I really am the weak link. So I stayed up extra late after work and like really had to like take time and like study things by myself. But like switching from teaching to corporate anyway, it's I find it way more peaceful. And I'm
Really? Oh
not talking
gosh.
about the kids. I'm talking about I will say on a personal point, I love a lot of my coworkers I worked with in teaching, but once when you're around kids enough, you tend to just kind of start treating each other like giant students,
Hmm.
and it gets a little bit unprofessional, yeah, unfortunately. And so
Interesting.
working in Japanese corporate, and I know we've all heard horror stories about working for Japanese companies and the overtime but I really, really enjoy working corporate with actual adults and who treat me as an adult. And I'm like, that's kind of cool. Like,
Of
it's really
course.
nice. So even as the newbie, I can connect with my coworkers. Even now, like I feel like I connect with everyone on my floor, and it's still 80% Japanese, but I have no problem making work friends, I suppose you could say. So I think it's just really nice, and everyone still doesn't know what I do as a designer, but I mean, I think now after several years at JGC, they have a better understanding, and yeah, just very good professional work relationships all around.
That's amazing. And you ended up from this fast-paced, tech-focused company that allow you to do UI UX
Mm,
into probably quite a traditional Japanese company and kind
yes.
of in a very traditional, old-fashioned business line, which is, still amazing, but not as I guess as sexy or cool as tech. Uh, so how was that from again as a foreigner, as a relatively young person, as a woman dealing with all that? As well as your job requirements, right? Which, and I
Mm,
know that you've progressed through the ranks, and you're progressing through the ranks of the company. But how was that impact? How did you manage it? And how do you think you've made the most out of it, if you have, or perhaps some areas that you
mm.
thought you should have focused a little bit more?
I've still got such a long way to go, but because it's only like my fifth year or so in design, and I mean, I've known colleagues in like 10 plus years. So, but I think I find even though JGC appeals is such a traditional company, we actually just switched to English only from last spring.
Oh wow.
So, because we're a very international company now, we have branches all throughout Asia, Houston, Canada, Europe, the Middle East. So, you know, engineering, gas, and everything else. But so even though I work with a lot of Japanese and the daily language is still Japanese, I think everyone is kind of used to working abroad for a certain period of time, or there's other international individuals from Philippines, Indonesia, India on the floor. So again, I think it's a very nice, cohesive environment where it's a international transition from a traditional Japanese company, as you said, because yeah, before it was very traditional, I was told. So yeah,
Right.
but it feels very flexible. They let us remote work 2 to 3 days a week. So
All right.
yeah, I really enjoy this new shift that a lot of Japanese companies are taking with their employees. So I can't complain. I'm sure there's still horrible companies out there.
Absolutely. Now, the podcast talks a lot or about technology. Okay.
Sure.
Although technology as a tool is not, in my opinion, the threat that sometimes we make it out to be. But I have to be honest that with regards
Mm,
to things, for example, like websites, I find
mm,
that 99% of corporate websites all look the same these days. Uh, so rather than ask you the age-old question these days of is AI going to take your job, which I won't, uh, the question I have for you is how do you stand out in your line of business, particularly for someone that wants to start a career in UI UX? I mean, how are what are some of the qualities or some of the focuses that will make a career stand out and your professional approach stand out in
mm.
this sector?
Well, funny you mentioned AI. I've been having this conversation a lot recently. I
I'm
think
sure.
I mean, I think the biggest push about that is the AI art, which I can see that. But my feeling about any new technology, whether it's AI, whatever comes out, is I mean, there's always room and there's always people willing to abuse technology. That's just the bottom line. I mean, cars are amazing things. They've come a long way in the years since automobiles were invented. Somebody can still drive a car into a crowd of people and kill someone. So you can always abuse technology. There's always
Of
room
course.
and there's always people out there that'll do it. So I think the threat is not necessarily new technology or AI starting there, but and I think when hearing all those things, I'm sure incoming into tech, because I think a lot of people incoming into tech would like to come into tech for the money and for salaries. That's the hook, line, and sink for a lot of people. And so I think there's a lot of buzzwords that are still confusing new techie people. But as far as a design perspective, I think you should always be up on the know because tech is always transforming, is always shifting and changing, if you will. And so as a newbie in the tech field, you definitely want to like take your time, look at what the current situation is, what's the new things. Even in design, there's new design trends coming up. As you mentioned, corporate websites all look the same. And people always hop on those trends too, a lot of the time, and design what's other websites are doing and copying each other. So it's kind of hard because, especially in Japan, they want to hire you because they have an idea of what other websites are doing. So they want to make sure you can copy that. But also you want to make sure you can stand out and be creative in your field, so to speak.
Right.
So I will say what got me hired, and I hate to say this, is having really fancy, good, clean graphics in my portfolio. And I hear a lot of times with other hiring managers, it's like, I want to see how you tell a story. I want to see how you design your design process, which is so important. But if you're looking at somebody who has limited idea about designing UX UI, what's going to catch them is the graphics,
Mm.
fortunately. So I guess it's a very hard question to answer because there's no really good answer, especially if we're talking about Japan, which is way more limited in their understanding of UX UI currently, versus other countries in America, Europe, wherever, where you have like lead designers and they know exactly what they're looking for and they want to see the storytelling, they want to see how you solve the problem. And I think that's what a lot of courses are going to tell you to put in your
Hmm.
portfolio. But I think if you're trying to enter a Japan company, they want to see if you're a competent designer, period. As in, can you make your portfolio pop and look really cool? Which I really just hate that. But,
Hmm.
because we always want to hear, I want to make the design pop. And I feel like designers hate hearing that. But I
Yeah, I
think,
get it.
yeah. And
Yeah.
as I'm a design mentor too, so I have a lot of mentees. And so I make sure their portfolios are definitely hitting the design process points because that's important. They did the research, they're doing the definition, and they're doing the designing, and that's important. But make sure you can answer questions about what's new in technology because it will not only come up in interviews, but they might pick it up in your portfolios too. So you always want to, even if it takes like 5 to 10 minutes to research what's happening this year on design, do it. Definitely. Because that will make you stand out.
I'm sure it takes a little longer than 5, 10 minutes, but I get your
Of
point.
course. Of course. I mean if you care. Yeah.
And Emery, last question for you. Now
Sure.
you've pivoted into a new career, even in between your pivot. You've worked in as a freelancer. You were in teaching. If you were to look ahead a little bit, what's lying ahead for you?
Ooh, great question. I mean, you could have asked me that 10 years ago and I would have been so sure. but, but I mean, I guess a lot could happen even in a year or two. So ideally, I really like the position I'm at now. And with my husband's career, he's a professional actor. So really, it's we're limited in what and where we can
Right.
go. So I guess I'll answer it in two ways. If I stay in Japan, I'll definitely continue in design, probably, and building a career here, as well as, I mean, networking here is so awesome in Tokyo. Like even you and me, we've been to some networking events and design talks like last October. That was fun.
It
So
was.
I'd say if I stay in Japan, it'll definitely be continuing to build and network my design career here. But if I transition to America, then yeah, I might consider something completely different and shift again. But at least while my remainder of my time in Japan, I want to, get as good as I can in the market here because there's a lot of room to grow, a lot of room to expand. And yeah, a lot of uncertainties in the future of tech here. So there's always things coming and going. And with AI, I'm sure we'll see a lot more of that in Japan. So really, it's just yeah, getting ready for those changes.
It'll be fun.
It'll be fun.
Emory, thank you so much for being on the show.
Of course, thank you for having me. And yeah, looking forward to more networking events in the future.
Fabulous. Thanks again.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
Well, folks, that's the end of another episode. Thank you for listening. Stay cool, stay positive.